there was a very, very nasty criticism against Kate, comparisons between the British and the Portuguese behavior, about being a mom in Portugal and being a mom in UK, saying that the English people usually leave the kids alone and this is normal.
He said, why would I sign that confession, you know? If an accident had happened, Madeleine had fallen, Kate and Jerry wouldn't have hidden that.
Can I just say, I think the worst thing about, you know, the fact that many people have blamed us and vilified us, and with hindsight, you know, it was clearly a mistake with hindsight.
Well, wasn't it also a mistake with foresight?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, in the previous analysis, we asked a simple question. Was it really like having dinner in your garden? Well, what's the answer to that question? I think many people, myself included, would say that it wasn't. Now, it seems logical to take that and run with it to say, you see, that's why something happened to Madeleine. But let's take this step by step, be careful and cautious in our reasoning. And if we do, and when we do, you'll see something that many, perhaps most, don't see. Are you ready for an epiphany in this case? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile and you've never hit the thanks button, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, as you can see in this image, almost on the 1-year anniversary, the Guardian speculated about charges, including neglect, being brought by Portuguese prosecutors. Neglect is mentioned in the headline, but the same word, as far as I can see, isn't explicitly used on the list of charges. To be clear, neglect tends to be habitual rather than a one-hit wonder, certainly for it to be chronic. Also, if there is neglect in one area, I'm talking in general with families, there's often neglect in other areas, certainly if it is worth bringing charges over. What I mean is, if Madeleine was left alone on May 3rd, then was she left alone on other nights? And again, if there was neglect of that nature in terms of putting children to sleep, was there any other form of neglect? Even if there was, are there mitigating factors such as 2 other young children to look after, as well as the situation where both parents are working? In the Ramsey case, a potential mitigating factor was the fact that Patsy had stage 4 cancer. Now, you may think I'm playing devil's advocate here or that I'm defending the McCanns. What I'm trying to demonstrate is why the Portuguese police hesitated in bringing charges and ultimately didn't bring charges. Because consider the alternative. If they had been charged, if they were put on trial, hang on, let's simplify things. Let's theorize Detective Amaral not being thrown off the case. We're speculating, we're doing a hypothetical here, right? Let's speculate Detective Amaral is not thrown off the case and somehow he gets his way, right? And let's say, just for the sake of argument, Kate is charged in this hypothetical situation. Now we're in court. Well, who would be able to testify against her? Who would be brought to testify against her for the prosecution? Not her husband, not any of her friends who were holidaying with her. Well, who then? Even if you as a prosecutor did find an Ocean Club staff member to testify against her, she would have a long list of people testifying for her, wouldn't she? And it's not clear whether a panel of judges wouldn't be swayed by Kate herself, as well as these defense witnesses. Even if they weren't, imagine the spectacle of a British mother on trial in Portugal in this holiday enclave in the Algarve, a doctor who has already lost her child, and even if the Portuguese win their case, they're likely to turn off the British tourists they want at their resorts. So even if they win, don't they lose? And I've just been reading an article about Rachel Behan, the British woman who's just taken her case to the European Court of Human Rights. She believes that Bruckner attacked her, and she feels that the reason the Portuguese police didn't press charges was they were trying to protect the sort of holiday industry. And so rather than thinking it's some kind of conspiracy, it might just be pure economics. So even if the Portuguese in this scenario, within this context, if they win, don't they lose? Does that make sense? Now, I do think it's interesting going back in time, and we can do that when we roll back the clock backwards and forwards by traversing the media narrative as it stood in real time. And we see how the narrative evolved towards true north at times, at other times away from it. On Tuesday, 29 May 2008, this was the Guardian's position on this idea of neglect. The parents of Madeleine McCann could face charges of neglecting their daughter on the night she disappeared. The first official confirmation of possible abandonment charges came in court documents published by The Times revealing options that Portuguese authorities are considering. Clarence Mitchell, the couple's spokesman, said the court papers did not mean such a charge would go ahead. Well, it seems as though he knew something that we didn't, perhaps at the time. He said, "This court document outlines the areas of the investigation and in no way suggests Kate and Jerry will be facing any such charges. Equally, we have heard nothing officially to suggest any such area of investigation is being considered. If there is any suggestion of neglect charges being considered, that will be vigorously denied because the legal advice that Kate and Jerry have received, both in Portugal and Britain, is that legally speaking, everything they were doing that week was well within the bounds of responsible parenting." And I find this statement fascinating. He explicitly says the legal advice Kate and Jerry received in Portugal and Britain is that legally speaking, everything they were doing was acceptable, basically. Now, that is an interesting caveat. You might think it's neglect, but the question is, what does the law say? What can you prove? And who knows, if you're away from your children but in the garden, if you're away from your children but checking on them every few minutes, is that really a crime? Isn't that what regular families sometimes do anyway? Then going back to the article, a neglect charge carries a maximum penalty of 10 years. The documents also mention abduction, homicide, and concealment of a corpse as potential areas of police inquiry. Now remember, in the McCanns, and by extension the Tapa 7 version of events, they as a group checked on their kids every few minutes. So they were both away from their kids and with them. Regardless of whether this is true or not, and whether you can prove it or disprove it, the story is nevertheless a negation of completely abandoning their kids, right? In other words, technically the children aren't completely left alone if one accepts their version of events. Now, I hope it's clear what I'm trying to make explicit here. Not whether the McCanns were at fault or not, but whether they could be prosecuted or not. Do you think they could be? Do you see it's a similar conundrum the prosecutors faced in Boulder, Colorado with the Ramsey case almost a decade earlier? If they took the case to trial, could they prove their case? Remember, it's not just a battle of witnesses. The witnesses closest to the victim are going to support the parents. Also, you're going up against very powerful lawyers, so this is not just a sort of typical run-of-the-mill case. You're going to need your case to be unusually watertight or you're going to lose. Is it? Is it watertight without a doubt? If the Ramsey case is made more convoluted by the sheer number of possibilities, was it John, was it Patsy, was it Burke, who did what? Well, you might find yourself facing a similarly confounding conundrum here. If someone did something, who did what? Even worse, when? And what exactly did happen? What was done to Madeleine? Now, whatever we may say, it's clear the authorities weren't certain of their case and didn't feel it was worthwhile to pursue it. Ultimately, it seems they decided the charges weren't serious enough to justify prosecution, which may seem crazy. A little girl died, didn't she? But if she died accidentally, as may have happened in the Ramsey case, and if you accept that, then what is all the fuss about? If there is an accidental death, then whatever followed is fairly secondary in nature, isn't it? I'm not sure if it is, but those in charge of prosecuting, and not just any prosecution against the best paid defense lawyers in the kingdom, well, if you lost, you'd have egg on your face, even worse, with the country's entire media watching, and you might lose your job. And you'd perhaps end up with your trousers around your ankles and egg on your face, and who would want that? So that's one dimension to consider. The Guardian in May 2008 also references the following in the same article about neglect. It's quite frightening when I see myself in those early days, Kate writes. To me, I look incredibly fragile and confused and lost. Despite appearing to be brave and composed, she says, she was on the verge of a breakdown. I had an overwhelming urge to swim out across the ocean as hard and as fast as I could, to swim and swim and swim, until I was so far out and so exhausted I could just allow the water to pull me under and relieve me of this torment, she writes. Now, I'm not quite sure if that was a blog that she wrote, a diary post, or something that she wrote in her book. I don't think it's in her book because 2008 she hadn't written her book yet. Now, maybe it's just me, but Kate doesn't look that fragile to me, certainly in this interview.
It's funny, we were having such a good time, just like with our friends and their kids, and I think because it was a group of us, you're into each other, do you know what I mean? You kind of, your interactions with each other, whereas maybe if it had just been me and Jerry and the kids, you know, you probably spend a bit more time looking around, you know.
When you would imagine she would be the most fragile when she was subjected to hours of police questioning, while instead of breaking down, she was swearing bloody tosser under her breath. And when you see her come out of that questioning, she kind of looks quite balanced, quite controlled, quite sort of level-headed. You know, at other times she's jogging, sometimes with Jerry, or visiting the Pope, or giving press conferences. Where in any interviews Kate or Jerry truly broken down, like we saw with the Petitos in the recent Netflix series, where the grief is raw and real and very much on display, where they literally overwhelmed on camera with very real emotions. It just really looks and feels very authentic, even years later. And if you follow the narrative closely, the McCanns were initially accused of being unemotional and running a too slick media campaign. At the time, and the time was, in terms of this article, September 2007, guess who came to their rescue? Jill Renwick. She may seem focused in public, old friend Jill Renwick said, but in private she's a broken woman. She's devastated by what has happened, can't speak about it sometimes. In public she's able to keep it together, as she believes this is what is best for Madeleine. Well, part of what they were doing in private was something like going jogging. Now, at the time they replied, you know, when they were sort of criticized, you know, we're not seeing much emotion from you, they replied to these criticisms that they were told, that they were advised not to show emotions, as this might trigger or reinforce the abductor in some way. Have a look at this headline. So, being emotional was a strategy? Okay. Of course, later on, once the penny dropped, Kate did start showing more emotion. Such as the instance when Kate, who had allowed Jerry to do most of the talking until then, broke her silence, spoke up, and suddenly seemed overwhelmed with emotion. Now look at this excerpt from The Guardian. Clutching Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's old cuddly toy, Kate stood at her husband's side while he thanked local people for their support and appealed for help in finding their daughter. Then Kate spoke up. Please continue to pray for Madeleine, she said. Her voice cracked as she added, she's lovely. Yeah, Kate looks fragile to me. The thing that is just kind of strange is, in the beginning, she seems very controlled, and then only later on does she seem fragile. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Or is Jill Renwick right, you know, that this is just a case of people who in public grieve a different way and in private grieve the way that they do? Now, once Kate started to apparently humanize herself, people wanted to know if she felt guilty. And you can see the conundrum here. As soon as you start to make yourself vulnerable, then the media sort of push in and they want more. And the problem with that question is, if you say yes, whether you are or aren't, but if you say yes, isn't it tantamount to a confession? And if you perhaps about to face charges, well, better not to admit to too much. I mean, you'd have your lawyers telling you that, you know, just to avoid legal landmines, right? Now, going back to the article, of course she wished she was with Madeleine at the moment she was taken, but asked in her first solo broadcast interview on Radio 4's Woman's Hour whether she felt guilty, she said, "I have come to terms a little bit with that. I didn't feel I was taking a risk." Now, this is where it gets quite tricky, where you say, if someone is grieving, are they able to keep their fingers on the pulse of what is legally sensitive and all that? And the McCanns seem to be quite sensible in this regard. Anyway, the article continues, subsequently she has been quicker to express regret. "I just felt I had let her down and I was desperately sorry we weren't there," she told The Guardian last month. Now, it's different to say, "I was desperately sorry we weren't there," and "I'm desperately sorry something else." The McCanns have also been criticized for the slickness of their publicity campaign, but friends of the couple believe it is the best way to find the truth about what happened. And didn't you have a similar criticism with the Ramseys? Perhaps significantly, Mrs. McCann has also started to give more details about what happened on the night, spelling out in the same Guardian interview that someone broke in and took Madeleine. Earlier in the summer, she and Jerry danced around this detail. Now, these aren't my words. These are the words in this article written at the time that these events were playing out. Now, I guess I have been dancing around the question posed at the outset as well. Was Madeleine alone when she died? Now, I want to deal with this question across 3 dimensions. Number 1, patterns of behavior during their week in Praia da Luz. 2, sleeping arrangements. And 3, the night in question. Now let's deal with each very, very briefly. Number 1, patterns of behavior during their week in Praia da Luz. Regardless of what we know or think we know, for neglect to be really serious, it would need to be systemic, habitual, in other words. A pattern. Is there a pattern? In the Ramsey case, one can test this theory across a myriad of options. How was the family dog treated? Was the house neat and tidy? Were the children cooked and fed proper meals? Were they healthy? Did parents intervene when a child was hurt? Is the child often crying or distressed? Were they taken to the doctor? Was the attention they did receive appropriate, etc.? In the McCann case, the fabric is thinner because the children are necessarily younger, but there is something that stands out. Prior to Madeleine disappearing, she cried because when she woke up, she was alone, and she complained to her mother about this. It's not the end of the world, obviously. Parents can make mistakes, but in the context of what happened to Madeleine, minimizing this mistake after the fact is something of an orange flag, maybe even a red one.
I don't want to dwell on it too much. I don't know if you saw the documentary last night, so I have talked about it. Madeleine made a comment in passing that, where were you when I cried? Not just to mummy, by the way, just generally. It just seemed a bit odd. It was a very kind of passing remark, and we just thought she doesn't usually wake up, and she woke up, that means that, she must have fallen back asleep very quickly, and then she moved on.
I think another question that touches on this one is, how did the McCanns, and by extension the whole group of doctors, really feel about babysitting? Only they would know, but what we do know is they apparently didn't feel the babysitting service was good enough for them, otherwise they would have used it. But think about those words, in a sense Madeleine's last words, "Where were you when I cried?" and this topic of neglect. Number 2, sleeping arrangements. Although it's regularly stated that Madeleine was sleeping in the other room with the twins, some have suggested that the twins slept with the McCanns in the parents' bedroom. Why? Well, because Madeleine had trouble sleeping, and either she was disturbing them or they were disturbing Madeleine. Now, what seems to give some credence to this notion is this image showing clearly the parents' beds moved away from the cupboard, well away from the cupboard, which would have provided enough room, certainly in theory, for the cots. We know Amaral speculated about the same thing. If the cots were in the parents' bedroom, then didn't it mean Madeleine did sleep alone? And if she slept alone, was that because she had trouble sleeping? And if she had trouble sleeping, how did the parents typically try to deal with that? Number 3, the night in question. Remember I mentioned an epiphany. During the night in question, Amaral believes Madeleine got up, fell off a sofa, and died of her injuries. Now, this reminds me of the scenario where John Bonet takes a piece of pineapple and is hit over the head in the kitchen with a flashlight. To me, it's crude. And so this same scenario from Amaral to me is crude, too crude, right? In other words, we are asked to accept that what happened to Madeleine happened when the parents were having dinner. And Amaral himself seems to believe that. That may be what Amaral believes, but not all of his colleagues agree. Some have suggested Madeleine may have died while Kate was with her in a 90-minute window. And this now deleted article from September 2007 from The Sun repeats this theory. Right, here's an excerpt. A source told them police believe the death happened before dinner in the period between 7 o'clock and 8:30. During this time, Madeleine's father was seen playing tennis at the complex. Therefore, the child and her twin siblings were in the charge of the mother. Now, what I think is quite important in that is the police being specific in terms of that timestamp. I'm just not sure that's the timestamp that they should be looking at.
I fear you might be right.
There is also potentially additional reinforcement to this theory from an upstairs witness, Mrs. Fenn's niece. Anyone know about that? It's beyond the scope of this analysis to deal with that, but her observations, as well as a few additional aspects, including the formation of cadaverine, how long that chemical process needs, will provide some interesting nuances to the timeline that very few seem to have considered. In any event, Amaral has said, quote, there is no hint, no proof that the child was kidnapped. On the contrary, there are hints that the parents were negligent, and there are hints there was hiding of the body. That's according to ex-lead investigator Detective Gonzalo Amaral through a translator. I think Detective Amaral is the sort of Kolar of the MCCANN case. And so he says, this was our point of view in 2007, that she was dead. Now, what hints do you think he's referring to? Going back to the article, Detective Amaral was so sure of the McCann's guilt that he went as far as publishing a book after he was taken off the case that suggested the British Secret Service MI5 helped conceal Madeleine's body. This is also a quote from that article. Well, I'm not sure I believe that. Do you?
Do you think there's a sense, I'm speculating obviously, but where the Portuguese police feel this is one case we don't want to revisit? There was so much publicity around it, and not all favourable publicity, certainly here, to the Portuguese police.
I think we had those concerns, but actually, if you speak to Andy Redwood and his team, he's senior investigating officer from the Met. He's saying, the people he's working with in Portugal do want to solve this.
This is also a mirror image to the Ramsey case, where you sort of have, after the fact, the parents complaining about the police, that the investigation is stalled, that they unfairly targeting them, and then the police in a way kind of unable to respond, unable to really say anything, and then basically the response from the police is really silence and a sense of intransigence.
Would you ever go back yourselves, put up some posters, or as another way of trying to generate interest and get more evidence again?
I mean, I do go back. I mean, I haven't been since last April, but I do go back for personal reasons. I mean, obviously that's...
You go back regularly, do you?
Well, I might once or twice a year. It's gone down to now.
So, was Madeleine alone when she died? Have you changed your mind on this question? If you think Madeleine died on May 3rd in the apartment, do you think that happened when the parents were at dinner, or that there was some other scenario? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.